The shuttle landed hard on the fortress moon of Caltharus, and the doors opened with a hiss that echoed across the cold steel platform. 46 cadets stepped out into the gray light of a world that had no sun of its own. It borrowed light from the gas giant it orbited, and that borrowed light made everything look pale and unfinished. The air tasted like metal and recycled oxygen. Nobody smiled. Nobody was meant to. The Galactic Joint Military Academy stood ahead of them like a scar carved into the rock. It was not beautiful. It was not designed to be. It was designed to remind every cadet who walked through its gates that comfort was something they had left behind. The walls were black stone reinforced with energy shielding. The corridors inside were narrow on purpose. Everything about this place said the same thing. You are small. You are nothing. Prove otherwise. Elias Morrow stepped off the shuttle last. He carried one bag over his shoulder and wore the standard gray intake uniform that hung a little loose on his frame. He was not tall. He was not wide. He had no claws or armored skin or bioluminescent markings. He had brown eyes and short dark hair and hands that looked like they had been used for work and not much else. He looked like exactly what the other species thought humans were: unremarkable, fragile, out of place. Around him, the other cadets were impossible to ignore. The Draelith stood nearly 8 feet tall with black exoskeletons that clicked when they moved. Their eyes were deep red, and they looked at everything like they were already calculating how to kill it. The Veylani were slender and silver-skinned with large dark eyes that seemed to look through you rather than at you. They were psychically sensitive. They could feel emotions the way other species felt heat. The Soreshi were compact and dense with oversized craniums and forearms each. They processed information faster than most computers. Every species here had been engineered by evolution or technology or both to be. Extraordinary. Elias was none of those things. He found his assigned quarters on the lower level. The room was barely bigger than a closet, with 2 bunks carved into the wall and a small shared space in between. His bunkmate was already there, a young Veylani female named Celine. She was sitting on the edge of her bunk with her hands clasped together and her large dark eyes blinking too fast, which was a sign of nervousness in her species. She looked up when he entered. She tried to read him the way Veylani always read new people. She reached out with her empathic sense, expecting to find a usual emotional noise that every living being carried around: fear, excitement, anger, ambition, something. She found stillness, not emptiness, not the cold blank void of someone who felt nothing. It was more like the surface of deep water, calm on top, but deep, very deep, and very dark underneath. She pulled her senses back quickly, like she had touched something hot. Elias set his bag down and nodded at her. He said his name. She said hers. He asked if she needed the top or bottom bunk. She said bottom. He climbed to the top without another word and lay on his back staring at the ceiling. Celine wanted to ask him questions. Where are you from? Why did you come here? Are you afraid? But something about the stillness around him made her keep her mouth shut. It was not rudeness. It was not hostility. It was a fence built so carefully and so completely that she understood immediately it had taken years to build. Whatever was behind it, he did not want anyone to see. The next morning, all 46 cadets assembled in the central hall. The floor was raw stone. The ceiling was high and lost in shadow. The air was cold enough to make Celine shiver. The Draelith cadets stood like statues. The Soreshi whispered calculations to each other. The humans stood alone. There were only 3 of them in the entire intake. Elias was one. Then Drillmaster Torvan Ket walked in, and the hall went silent. He was Draelith, but bigger than the cadets, older. His exoskeleton was scarred with deep grooves from battles. that most species only read about in history files. His left arm had been replaced with a cybernetic limb that hummed faintly with energy. His red eyes swept the room like targeting sensors. He did not introduce himself. Everyone already knew who he was. He had broken more cadets than any drill master in the Academy's history. He was proud of that. He spoke, and his voice filled the hall like a weapon. He told them they were nothing. He told them the uniform they wore meant nothing. He told them that the Academy had a tradition called the Crucible. 7 days of trials designed to test the mind and body and spirit of every cadet beyond what they believed they could survive. 1/3 of every class broke during the Crucible. Some quit, some collapsed. Some had to be carried out. He said this was not a failure of the Academy. It was a success. Because the galaxy did not need officers who could break. It needed officers who could not. Then Torvan stopped walking. He turned his massive scarred head and looked directly at Elias Morrow. The human stood in the back row. He was the smallest person in the room. He met the drill master's gaze without blinking. Torvan said 4 words that the entire hall heard. Some of you do not belong here. The Crucible will prove it. Elias did not flinch. He did not look away. He stood in that cold hall surrounded by giants and monsters and psychics and geniuses, and he breathed slowly and steadily like a man who had heard worse things spoken by worse creatures in worse places. Celine felt the room ripple with emotion, fear, aggression, determination, ego. From Elias, she felt nothing but that same deep still water. And somewhere far below the surface something moved. Something old. Something that had learned a long time ago that the worst thing the universe could do to you was not kill you. It was let you survive. The Crucible began on the 2nd day, before the artificial dawn cycle had even started. Alarms screamed through the corridors at a frequency designed to trigger panic responses in most known species. Cadets stumbled out of their quarters, half-dressed and confused. Torvan was waiting for them in the central hall, with his arms behind his back and his red eyes glowing in the dim emergency lighting. He did not explain. He simply pointed to the doors behind him and said 1 word. Enter. The first trial was called the Sensory Flood. Each cadet was locked alone inside, a sealed chamber no bigger than a coffin standing upright. Once the door closed, the chamber came alive. Blinding white light flashed at irregular intervals. Sound hit from every direction. Not just loud sound, but layered frequencies designed to interfere with neural processing. The air was pumped full of chemical compounds that triggered species-specific fear responses. For the Draelith, it mimicked the scent of molten rock and volcanic collapse. For the Veylani, it created a psychic static so thick it felt like drowning in someone else's screaming mind. For the Soreshi, it disrupted their ability to think clearly, which was the one thing they depended on more than anything. 11 cadets broke in the first hour. 2 Veylani collapsed completely and had to be pulled from their chambers. 1 Draelith punched through the wall of his chamber and had to be sedated. In chamber 39. Elias Morrow sat cross-legged on the floor. His eyes were closed. His hands rested on his knees. The lights hit his eyelids and turned the darkness behind them into red fire. The sound pounded against his skull. The chemical agents flooded his lungs and tried to find the pathways to fear in his brain. He breathed in. He breathed out. His heart rate stayed at 62 beats per minute. The monitoring officers in the observation room stared at their screens. One of them, a Soreshi technician, ran the readings twice because she was certain the equipment was broken. It was not broken. The human was simply not reacting. After 4 hours, the chambers opened. Elias stood up and walked out. He did not look tired. He did not look shaken. He looked like a man who had just sat quietly in a room and waited for the noise to stop. The second trial came the next day. They called it the Predator Room. Each cadet was placed alone in a pitch-black space roughly the size of a cargo bay. The room was equipped with sensory projectors that could simulate anything: sound, smell, vibration through the floor, the feeling of breath on the back of your neck. Each simulation was custom designed for each species. It found the predator that lived deepest in your evolutionary memory, the thing your ancestors feared before they had language to name it. And it put that thing in the room with you. For most species, it worked exactly as intended. The Draelith were fearless in battle, but they came from a volcanic world, where the apex predator hunted through tremors in the ground. When the floor began to shake in patterns that matched those ancient rhythms, several of them dropped into defensive crouches and could not move. The Veylani heard psychic signatures of creatures that had hunted their kind 10,000 years ago. They screamed. Elias stood in the dark, the simulation built around him. Heavy breathing from something large. The scrape of claws on metal. Footsteps that circled him, slowly getting closer. The smell of something rotten and warm. Every trick the system had to make a human feel like prey in the dark. Elias did not move. He did not crouch. He did not run. He stood still and he listened. Not with the panic of prey, but with the calm focus of someone who had spent time in real darkness with real things that wanted to hurt him. When the lights came back on, he looked at the proctor, standing by the door, and asked calmly if the simulation was working correctly. He said he was not sure it had started. The proctor did not know how to respond to that .torva and watched the recording 3 times that night. He told himself the human was too primitive to understand fear, that his species had not evolved enough for the predator room to work properly. He told himself this because the alternative explanation was worse. The alternative was that the human understood the fear perfectly and simply did not care. The third trial was the worst. The isolation box. Total sensory deprivation for 72 hours. No light. No sound, no touch, no sense of time passing. The body floated in a suspension gel that removed the feeling of gravity. It was designed to make the mind eat itself. Without input from the outside world, the brain began to create its own reality, hallucinations, paranoia, the feeling that you had been forgotten, that no one was coming, that you would float in, that nothing forever. 21 cadets tapped out before the first day ended. Another 9 broke on the second day. By the time the boxes opened after 72 hours, only 14 cadets had completed the full trial. Elias was one of them. When his box opened, he stepped out slowly. He blinked at the light and stretched his arms above his head. His muscles were stiff. His stomach was empty. He looked at the nearest proctor and asked where the mess hall was. In the observation room, Celine stood with her hands pressed against the glass. She had watched his biosignals for 3 days. She had felt the faintest edges of his emotional state leaking through the box's shielding. He had not been empty in there. He had not been calm. She had felt flashes of something terrible underneath. Memories. Old ones. Cold ones. The kind that do not fade because they were burned too deep. He felt everything. Every moment of those 72 hours. He just did not let it win. She whispered to the cadet standing next to her. He's not unfeeling. He feels all of it. He just does not let it in. The cadet looked at her and then looked at the human walking calmly toward the cafeteria and said nothing because there was nothing to say. That night Torvan requested Elias Morrow's full file from Coalition Intelligence. It arrived 2 hours later. Most of it was redacted. Black bars over everything. Service history. Medical records. Psychological evaluations. All hidden behind classification levels that even a drill master could not access. Only one note was visible. It was written by a human military psychologist, and it was short. Candidate Morrow has already been broken. Recommend admission. There is nothing left for the Crucible to take. Tarvan read it 4 times. Then he closed the file and sat alone in his office in the dark for a very long time. He had spent 30 years breaking cadets. He had never once received a file that told him he was too late. The Crucible ended and 18 cadets went home. Some left on stretchers. Some left in silence. Some left crying. The remaining 28 moved into regular training, and the academy shifted from trying to break them to trying to build them into something the galaxy could use. Elias, Morrow said nothing about the Crucible. He did not celebrate surviving it. He did not talk about it with the other cadets. He moved into the next phase of training like a man stepping from one room into another. No pause, no reflection. Just forward. But things had changed around him. The other cadets looked at him differently now. Not with respect. Not yet. But with a kind of careful attention. Like watching an animal they could not classify. He was still the smallest person in every room. He still had no armor or claws or psychic ability. But he had walked through the same fire as the rest of them and had come out the other side without a single crack showing on the surface. That made some of them curious. It made others afraid. Training moved fast. Tactical simulations. Combat drills. Strategic planning exercises. Leadership assessments. The instructors pushed hard and expected more every day. Cadets were ranked and re-ranked constantly. The pressure never stopped. Elias did not rise to the top immediately. He was not the fastest or the strongest or the smartest. The Soreshi could outthink him in seconds. The Draelith could crush him with one hand. The Veylani could sense enemy positions. Before scanners could, but Elias had something none of them had. In tactical exercises where the scenario went wrong and the plan fell apart and chaos took over. Most cadets froze for half a second. Just half a second. A tiny gap between what they expected and what they got. In that gap, their training stalled and their instincts screamed and they lost time. Elias had no gap. When things went wrong, he was already moving. Not because he was faster, because he expected things to go wrong. He planned for the worst outcome before anyone else even considered it. His tactical solutions were not elegant. They were not creative or brilliant. They were ugly and efficient and brutal, and they worked. One instructor retired. Veylani fleet commander watched Elias run a squad through a disaster scenario. The scenario involved a failed evacuation with limited resources and no backup coming. Every other squad leader tried to save everything. Tried to be heroes. Elias immediately cut losses. He abandoned indefensible positions. He rationed everything. He made hard choices in seconds that other cadets could not make in minutes. The instructor wrote in her report, "He does not think like a soldier. He thinks like a survivor. That is either his greatest strength or his most dangerous limitation." I am not yet sure which. Weeks passed. Celine watched Elias carefully, not because she was ordered to, because she could not help it. He was a mystery wrapped in silence. He trained hard. He ate alone. He slept little. He helped others when they needed it, but never asked for help himself. He was kind in small ways that most people missed. He would adjust his pace during runs so a struggling cadet did not fall too far behind. He would quietly correct the mistake in someone's work without making them feel stupid. He shared notes. He shared food. The food sharing was the thing that finally made Celine understand. She learned from the Academy's cultural database that on the human outer colonies food was survival. Sharing food with someone meant you trusted them enough to reduce your own chances of living. It was not a casual thing. It was not politeness. It was the deepest gesture a colonial human could offer. Elias shared food with everyone. One day, During a team combat exercise, Celine reached for the same equipment panel as Elias, and their hands touched. Skin to skin. For a Veylani, direct physical contact opened the empathic channel wide. She had no time to brace herself. It hit her like a wall. Cold. Terrible cold. Not the cold of space or ice, but the cold of a place where warmth had been used up and never came back. Hunger that was not a feeling, but a state of being. A body that had forgotten what full meant. And underneath all of that, a patience so vast and so deep it terrified her. Not the patience of someone waiting for something good. The patience of someone who had learned that suffering did not end just because you wanted it to. So you stopped wanting. You stopped counting days. You just kept breathing because that was all that was left to do. She saw flashes. Not clear images, but feelings attached to fragments. A dark room. Many people. The sound of someone crying that slowly stopped and did not start again. A boy's hands too thin and too steady pulling wires out of a broken wall panel to build something. The taste of recycled water that had gone through the system so many times it tasted like metal and nothing else. And above it all, a sky that never changed. 19 months of sky that never changed. Celine yanked her hand back. Her eyes were wet. She was shaking. Elias looked at her. He knew what had happened. He did not apologize. He did not explain. He just looked at her with those brown eyes that carried the weight of a world that had eaten itself alive and said nothing. That night, Celine found a cup of tea outside her quarters. It was still warm. There was no note. She held it in both hands and drank it slowly, and understood that this was the only way he knew how to say, "I'm sorry you saw that." And also, "I trust you with what you saw." She never told anyone what she felt when she touched him. That was his to carry. She would not add to it. Meanwhile, something else was shifting. Kale, a young Draelith cadet from a high-ranking military family, had been watching Elias with growing frustration. Kale was everything Elias was not. Big. Strong, armored, born into a warrior culture that valued power above all. He could not understand how this small, soft creature was earning the quiet attention of the instructors. One afternoon in the common area, Kale stepped in front of Elias and made his challenge public. He called humans weak. He called them soft. He said they had no natural weapons and no evolutionary gifts and had stumbled into space by accident. While real warrior species had earned their place among the stars. The room went quiet. Everyone watched. Elias looked up at Kale. The Draelith was nearly 3 feet taller than him. His exoskeleton could stop a plasma round. His hands could crush stone. Elias held his gaze for a long moment. There was no anger in his eyes. No fear. No wounded pride. Just that deep, still water. Then he spoke. We did not stumble. We crawled. And we did not stop. He walked around Kale and left the room. Kale stood there with his challenge unanswered, and his insult ignored and felt. Something he had never felt before. He felt small. The next day, the Academy announced the final trial, a full-scale, simulated planetary defense scenario. Torvan selected the squad leaders personally. He chose Elias Morrow. The other instructors protested. Too inexperienced. Too unknown. Too human. Torvan silenced them with a look. I want to see what he does when others depend on him. That is where a human either rises or shatters. The simulation chamber was the size of a small city. It could generate terrain and weather and structures so real that the brain could not tell the difference. When the doors sealed behind the cadets, the academy disappeared, and they were standing on the surface of a dying colony world. Under a red sky with smoke on the horizon and the sound of distant explosions shaking the ground beneath their boots. Elias looked at the sky and stopped walking. Celine was right behind him. She felt it instantly. A wave of something so powerful it nearly knocked her back. Not fear, not anger, recognition. His emotional signature, which had been that deep still water for months, suddenly cracked open for one terrible second, and she saw what was underneath. An ocean of grief so vast it had no bottom. And then, just as fast, he sealed it shut again. Like a man slamming a door on a fire. She understood. The simulation was a colonial siege. Limited resources. Overwhelming enemy. Civilians to protect. No rescue coming. Someone had designed this trial to test the cadets against the worst possible scenario. For Elias, it was not a test. It was a memory. He stood still for 3 seconds. 3 seconds where every cadet in his squad watched him and waited. 3 seconds where the simulation burned and screamed around them. Then his eyes changed. The grief disappeared. The stillness came back, but it was different. Now, harder, colder, like iron that had been heated and hammered, and cooled so many times it could not be bent anymore. He turned to his squad. Celine, Kale, 2 Soreshi technicians named Drell and Vosk, of Veylani Communications, specialists named Than, and 3 other cadets from mixed species. He gave his first order in a voice that did not shake. Rations. Count everything we have. Assume no resupply. Assume no rescue. We survive with what we carry. Kale stared at him. This was a simulation. Rescue would come eventually. The trial would end. But Elias was not planning for a trial. He was planning for the real thing. Kale opened his mouth to argue and then closed it. Something in the human's eyes told him this was not the time. They moved. Elias led them through the burning colony streets with a focus that bordered on mechanical. He checked every building, mapped every route, identified choke points and fallback positions. He found the civilian population. 300 simulated colonists huddled in a central shelter. Men and women and children with digital faces that looked real enough to make your chest hurt. Elias looked at the children for a long moment. Then he looked away and started giving orders. He split his squad into roles. Celine on empathic scanning to detect enemy movement before sensors could. Kale on point defense at the main approach. Drell and Vosk on technical systems keeping the shelter's power and air recycling running. Than on communications trying to reach any simulated allied forces. The others rotated between patrol and rest. Rest was a word Elias used for everyone, except himself. The first enemy wave hit 6 hours in. Fast-moving alien assault units designed to overwhelm through numbers. Kale held the main gate with a ferocity that cracked the pavement under his feet. His exoskeleton rang like a bell with every impact. He roared battle cries in his native tongue, and for the first time in the trial he felt alive. But it was Elias who won the fight. Not with strength. With positioning. He had placed traps in the corridors. Collapsed a building to block a flanking route. Redirected the enemy into a kill zone where the squad's combined fire cut them apart. It was not heroic. It was not glorious. It was efficient and ugly, and it worked. The second wave came 12 hours later. Bigger, harder. The simulation was learning, adapting, testing them. Elias adapted faster. Pulled Kale back from an exposed position before the Draelith even realized he was being flanked. He rerouted power from non-essential systems to boost their defensive shields. He gave his own simulated rations to the civilian NPCs and ate nothing himself. Celine told him he needed to eat. He said he was fine. She knew he was lying. She could feel the edges of his hunger like an old scar being pressed. This was familiar to him. Going without. Making sure others did not have to. Then the simulation changed. Midway through the second day, the enemy force doubled. Supply lines were cut. A message came through the communication channel. Rescue delayed. No timeline given. Hold position. 3 other squads across the simulation map broke immediately. Their leaders panicked, made bad calls, got their squads killed or surrendered. The leaderboard in the observation room showed red across the board, except for Squad 7. Ilias Morrow's squad. He gathered them in the shelter basement. They were tired and scared, and some of them were injured from the last wave. Kale had a crack running down his left arm plate. Celine's empathic senses were overloaded from the constant psychic noise of battle. Drell's lower arms were shaking from exhaustion. Elias looked at each of them. Then he said what he had said before on a different world in a different time when he was 14 years old. And the sky had not changed in 4 months. We are not getting rescued. So we hold. That is all there is. Nobody argued. Nobody could. Because the way he said it was not a command. It was a truth. Spoken by someone who had lived inside that truth for 19 months and come out the other side. Still breathing, they held. For 2 more simulated days they held. Elias slept 2 hours total. He moved through the compound like a ghost. Checking defenses. Adjusting positions. Talking to the squad. Not big speeches. Just small things. A hand on Kale's shoulder when the Draelith stress fractures made him grunt in pain. A quiet word to Thon when the Veylani's hands would not stop shaking. A look at Celine that said, "I know you can feel what I am feeling. I am sorry. Keep going." On the final day, the simulation threw everything it had at them. A full assault from all directions. Overwhelming force. The kind of attack designed to make the scenario unwinnable. Elias looked at the tactical display. He looked at his squad. He looked at the 300 civilians behind them. And he made a decision. He told Kale to take the squad and the civilians through the eastern tunnel to the extraction point. He said Drell and Vosk had rigged the shelter's reactor to overload on command. He said someone needed to stay behind to hold the main corridor, long enough for everyone to get clear, and then trigger the overload. Kale said no. He said they could all fight together. They could hold. Elias looked at him with those quiet brown eyes and said something that made Kale's chest hurt in a way no weapon ever had. "I have done this before. Let me do it again." "Get them out." Kale stared at him. Then he understood. This was not sacrifice. This was not heroism. This was a man returning to the one thing he knew how to do, better than anyone alive. Survive long enough for others to live. Kale took the squad. He took the civilians. He moved through the tunnel and he did not look back because he knew if he looked back, he would not be able to leave. Elias stood alone in the main corridor. He picked up a weapon. He checked the charge. He set the reactor timer. Then the enemy came. And he held. The simulation ended 17 minutes later. The extraction was successful. 300 civilians and 8 squad members reached the safe zone. Elias. Morrow died in the simulation holding a corridor by himself for 11 minutes longer than a tactical model predicted. A single human could dot in the observation room. The instructors were silent. The scores were displayed on the main screen. Squad 7 had the highest survival rate of any group in the trial. Cadets and civilians both. The mission was a complete success. At the bottom of the screen, one line read, Squad Leader Morrow. Status. Killed in action. Torvon stared at that line for a long time. Then he pulled up the colonial records from a place called Harrow's Reach. He read one line out loud to the silent room. Final survivors held the inner compound for 19 months. The youngest among them was 14 years old. Every eye in the debriefing room turned to Elias, who was sitting at the back of the room. Alive. Real. No longer in the simulation. Just a man in a gray uniform with brown eyes that held 19 months of something none of them could imagine. He looked at the table. He said nothing. He did not need to. 1 year passed. The academy did what it was built to do. It ground them down and built them back up. It filled the cracks with knowledge and discipline and purpose. It took 46 cadets and turned 26 of them into officers. The rest were sent home at various points along the way. Not in shame. In understanding. The galaxy needed many things, but it only needed a few who could carry the weight of command. Elias Morrow was one of the 20-6. He graduated in the top 5 of his class. Not first. That belonged to a Soreshi named Veylani, who could run battlefield calculations in her sleep, and probably did. Elias did not care about rank. He never had. Rank was a number on a board. It did not keep people alive. It did not hold a corridor. It did not share food when there was not enough. The graduation ceremony was held in the Academy's Grand Hall, a massive chamber carved from the moon's black rock with a ceiling so high it disappeared in the darkness. Banners from 40 species hung along the walls. Dignitaries from across the coalition sat in tiered seating that rose up like a cliff face on both sides. Admirals, ambassadors, fleet commanders, leaders who controlled armies and navies and worlds. They had come to see the new officers who would one day replace them. The cadets stood in formation on the central floor. Clean uniforms, straight backs, species of every shape and size and color standing side by side. It was the kind of image the coalition used for recruitment posters. Unity in diversity. Strength through cooperation. But the people in that room who had actually fought wars knew the truth. Unity was earned. Trust was earned. Strength was not given to you by standing next to someone. It was given to you by suffering next to someone and choosing to keep standing. Before the ceremony began, Kale found Elias in the staging corridor. The Draelith looked different than he had a year ago. Not physically. He was still massive and armored and built like something designed to break things. But the arrogance was gone. Something quieter had taken its place. Something earned. He stood in front of Elias and did not speak for a moment. Then he raised his right hand and pressed his closed fist against the center of his own chest plate. The sound rang through the corridor like a single deep bell. Elias recognized the gesture. He had studied Draelith culture in the Academy's library. During the nights, he could not sleep, which was most of them. The gesture was called Calithvos. It meant I was wrong about you. Not in a small way. In a way that changed me. It was a warrior's admission of misjudgment. Among the Draelith, it was considered more courageous than any act of battle, because it required something the Draelith valued above all else, the strength to surrender pride that it was almost never given to non-Draelith. In the entire history of the Coalition, it had been recorded fewer than 40 times. Across species lines, Elias looked up at Kale. He did not smile. He did not make it a moment larger than it was. He simply nodded once. A small movement. But in that small movement was everything. Acceptance, respect, the understanding that the two of them had walked through something together and come out different on the other side. Kale lowered his fist. Then he did something even more unexpected. He said 2 words in the human language he had been secretly learning for 3 months. Thank you. His accent was terrible. The sounds were wrong for a mouth designed for Draelith phonetics. It was the most sincere thing Elias had heard in a year. He almost smiled. Almost thought Silene found him next. She did not need to say much. A year of living beside someone. A year of feeling the edges of his grief and his patience and his quiet, unbreakable kindness. A year of tea left outside her door on the nights when the empathic noise of the Academy made her head ache. A year of silences that said more than words. She stood beside him and said one thing. I I've never sensed anyone carry so much and still choose to be kind. Elias looked at her. For 1 second, the still water shifted, and she saw something underneath that was not grief or pain or patience. It was gratitude. Raw and deep and real. The gratitude of a man who had spent so long surviving alone that he had forgotten what it felt like to be seen. He did not say thank you. He did not need to. She felt it. The ceremony began. Names were called. Officers walked across the stage. The audience applauded in the customs of their species. The Draelith struck their chest plates. The Veylani hummed a harmonic frequency that resonated through the room. The Soreshi clicked their secondary arms. The humans clapped. Every species had their own way of honoring achievement. When Elias, Morrow's name was called, he walked across that stage alone. No family in the audience. No homeworld delegation. Harrow's Reach did not send delegations. There was barely anyone left to send. He walked with the steady, unhurried pace of a man who had been walking for a very long time and had learned that the speed did not matter as long as you did not stop. His uniform was clean and pressed and fit him properly now. He was still not tall, still not armored, still not gifted with psychic ability or superhuman intelligence. He was just a man, but every eye in that hall was on him. After the ceremony, Torvan called Elias to his office one final time. The room was the same as it had always been. Sparse, cold, functional. The drill master sat behind his desk, with his scarred exoskeleton and his cybernetic arm and his red eyes that had seen more war than most species had fought in their entire histories. He told Elias the truth. He said he had designed parts of the Crucible with Elias specifically in mind. He had made it harder, more intense, more targeted. He had wanted to prove that humans were not ready, that admitting them was a political mistake, that they would break under real pressure. He said this without apology, because Draelith did not apologize for testing strength. But he said it with something that sounded almost like respect. Then he asked the question that had kept him awake for a year. The drills, the trials, the isolation, the fear. None of it reached you. Why? Elias sat in the chair across from him. He was quiet for a long time. Not because he did not know the answer, because he was deciding whether to give it. Then he spoke. It did reach me, sir. All of it. Every trial. Every test. Every simulation. I felt all of it. Torvan leaned forward. Elias continued. But I have already lived through the version that was real. Your simulations end. The lights come back on. Someone opens the door. The scenario resets. On Harrow's Reach, there was no reset. There was no door. There was just the next day and the day after that and the day after that for 19 months. I was 14. I watched people I loved disappear one at a time. Not in battle. Not in glory. They just got quieter and thinner, and one day they did not wake up. He paused. You wanted to break me. But Harrow's Reach got there first. What grew back does not break the same way twice. The room was silent. Torvan, who had broken 10,000 cadets across 30 years, who had commanded fleets and survived wars that burned across star systems, had no response. None. The first time in his career, he sat across from a cadet who had beaten him, not through strength or cleverness or defiance, through something the Draelith did not have a word for, something that only grew in the space left behind after everything else had been taken away. Torvan stood slowly. He extended his right hand across the desk. It was a human gesture. He had researched it. He had practiced it. An open hand offered in respect from one equal to another. Elias looked at the hand. Then he reached out and took it. They shook once. Firm, steady. Two. Warriors from different worlds who had finally found the common ground between them. Elias walked out of the office and down the long corridor toward the landing platform where a shuttle waited to carry the new officers to their first assignments. Celine was there. Kale was there. Others who had survived the year together were there. He walked across the graduation stage one more time in his memory. The smallest figure on the largest stage. No armor, no claws, no psychic gifts, no evolutionary weapons. Just a man who had been broken at 14 and had spent every day since then putting himself back together one piece at a time. Celine stood in the crowd and felt the emotional signatures of every species in that hall. Draelith, Veylani, Soreshi, dozens of others. All different. All unique. All carrying their own histories and fears and strengths. But in that moment, every single one of them pointed toward the same thing. Respect. The galaxy had always measured strength in what a species could do. How hard they could hit. How fast they could think. How brightly they could burn. But humans had learned something the rest of the galaxy had not. Strength was not about what you could do. It was about what you could endure and still stand back up. The drill was meant to break cadets. The human did not react. Not because he could not feel it. Not because he was too simple or too numb or too broken to understand, but because he had already survived worse. And he was still here. He would always be here. That was the thing about humans. You could burn their worlds. You could starve their children. You could take everything from them down to the last breath of clean air and the last drop of clean water. And they would still stand up. They would still share their food. They would still hold the corridor. They would still be kind. And that was the most terrifying thing in the galaxy. Not a species that could not be hurt, but a species that could be hurt more than any other and still choose to keep going. The shuttle lifted off. Calthorus fell away below them. The borrowed light of the gas giant painted everything in pale gold. Elias Morrow looked out the window at the stars. He did not smile. But for the first time in a very long time, he felt something he had almost forgotten existed. Hope. And it did not feel borrowed at all.